foster, right, a positive image of the state. They will use, they will also have to customize the message, right? Because the particular local audiences that they are reaching out to will be different, right? Their cultural backgrounds will be different. So they will have to, if you talk about international communication, right, you have to take into account intercultural differences, right, in order to be able to communicate effectively to different audiences, right, across the world, across the globe. So you have to take into account the particular context, cultural characteristics of the audiences that you're trying to attract. You're crafting your message for, right? So that it would be more palatable and acceptable to those audiences. So you find that diplomats are starting to use. Actually, they've started using digital tools of communication to basically communicate with each other as well as the general public, and this includes social media as well. So you find that the strategy, Holmes says that the strategy of managing change through digital tools and virtual collaborations actually would require the integration of both the online and offline diplomacy, right? So it does, whatever message that you're giving out, that you're putting out on the online space needs to align with the offline diplomacy, face-to-face meetings that you have as well, right, with your counterparts. And you shouldn't privilege one over the other. Both are just as important, but they find that actually still the offline face-to-face diplomacy holds king, right? It's still the best way of building trust, forming relationships with the other side compared to online diplomacy. So online has always, even though it's important because it's actually expanded, right? Broaden the reach, broaden the ways in which they can craft their messages, right? But the online still needs to be complementary, still needs to play a complementary role to offline diplomacy. Neither being more dominant, actually. Okay, so this is This is actually a case of UK's ambassador John Casson, who is in Egypt, and how he used the digital tools, right, to build to help build the branding for UK in Egypt.
It makes sense for a diplomat to go to where people are and where power is. In the modern world, governments don't get to decide everything. The power to shape the world in all sorts of unexpected places. So by being on Twitter, we get to see what's going on, hear what people really think, and find good partners to work with. But now I've sent over 2,800 tweets, and I've got more than 1.25 million followers. That's about 1 in 3 of all Twitter followers in Egypt. Our audience is 93% Arabic speakers, and it's not just the traditional elite. 84% of people are youth, they're under 34 years of age. Fans of Liverpool Football Club. You've had him for a year now. I think it's time you found out the truth. His name isn't Mo Salah. He's called Mo Salah.
اسمه محمد صلاح. محمد صلاح.
Mo Salah, the Egyptian king.
We always get great engagement when we talk about the things that Egyptians love, like food and like football. Here on Twitter, we start with what Egyptians are passionate about, what Egyptians are talking about, and then we work to connect that to what we want to say. And that allows us to build an audience and then to get to say the tough things with a lot more trust. Education is a fantastically important issue to every Egyptian. I've learnt that from just seeing how much hunger there is from ordinary Egyptians to get access to world quality education, to give themselves a chance to build a better future. And that's driven our focus on reform of Egypt's schools, on increasing the partnerships that we give to Egyptians to allow them to access British world-class education. We've seen the fantastic achievements of Egyptian women who traditionally have not always been able to play a full role. We've seen fantastic achievements of Egyptians with disabilities. And so it's become a big feature of our diplomacy to include and listen to and inspire Egyptians from those backgrounds so that Egypt can benefit from the real wealth of the country, which is all 100 million Egyptians. I've lived here for 4 years and I've just seen how much talent and potential and aspiration there is in this country. And if we can invest in it, give people jobs, give people education, give them a voice, Egypt can really lead the way. We're human in the sense that we're very personal and authentic. I talk about things that I really like, things that genuinely make me laugh. We're human in the sense that we're two-way communication. We're not just telling people things, but interested in what they have to say to us. Twitter's allowed us to reach the parts that traditional diplomacy doesn't reach. People can see what I'm doing, they can make up their own minds about me, and we choose to make ourselves accountable to the Egyptian people when we say we're here doing things to help Egypt, and that makes the embassy better.
Okay, so I hope that gives you a better idea of what some of the ambassadors are doing or using Twitter for. What do you think of this approach? Is this something that would resonate with you? Is it something that you'll be interested in following, in reading? Yeah, exactly. That's what they are. That's what they are, actually. That's a good way of putting it, Gerald. Yeah. So I mean, they basically, they use a very subtle way, right? Very innocuous way of trying to. They are also showing, establishing rapport, right, with the followers, with the people in Egypt, and then turning it to try to connect things that they are saying that is of importance for the foreign policy um, stand of UK. Yeah. Okay, so when you look at digital diplomacy, Potter basically says that most people. I mean, when you use, it's really about the use of ICT, right, to achieve diplomatic objectives and the 8 policy goals. So basically, these were the 8 policy goals that Potter outlined, in his reading. So knowledge management, public diplomacy, information management, consular communication response, disaster response, internet freedom, external resources, policy planning. Yes, it does. It actually works very much like marketing and branding. Yeah. So if you think about marketing and branding of the state, that is exactly what digital diplomacy is, but it's happening on the in the online space. Yeah. Actually, I don't know whether you all would have read this before, but I think back in the 1990s, early 2000, they were saying that Singapore is actually very good at branding, right? Branding the state. Yeah. So I think there was an Economist piece about how Singapore was branding itself, and basically, um, using the same sort of marketing tools to brand itself. Yes, embassy. What's our essay? What's our essay competition did they run? Yeah, now that our SIA, right? The brand is, I mean, it's actually SIA was one of the, I mean, international brands that really took root. Yeah. Oh, future of U.S. relations in Southeast Asia. They're trying to tap on your suggestions, right? Because they're moving into Indo-Pacific, so they want to see how they can do it and not make the people ASEAN feel threatened. You know? Maybe it was a harbinger to come of AUKUS. Anyway, yeah, it's gonna be an interesting 10 to 20 years here, I think, until they get tired of playing in the region. Anyway, so this is actually how China, right, is actually using Twitter, right? Twitter diplomacy, the what we call the wolf warrior diplomats, right? How they're actually using social media for their Twitter diplomacy.
China's government doesn't like ordinary people using Twitter, so it's officially banned. But it's more than happy for its own diplomats to tweet regularly. The Ministry of Information's rising star, Zhao Lijian, is very active, posting around 59,000 tweets since joining exactly a decade ago. He's also amassed some 620,000 followers. This tweet against the United States did pretty well. Lots of likes and lots of retweets. His colleagues are making similarly inflammatory statements. The Chinese embassy in India described calls for China to pay coronavirus compensation as ridiculous and eyeball-catching nonsense. China's ambassador in the Netherlands accused President Trump of being full of racism. And China's embassy in Venezuela ended a furious Twitter thread by saying some of its critics could put on a mask and shut up. Well, while they're not out of keeping with typical Twitter discourse, and you may even agree with one or two of them, they're far from diplomatic. And the data suggests this is just the beginning. Chinese state Twitter accounts have tripled over the last year, and posts have quadrupled.
Okay, so China is catching on, right, to how to use Twitter. Okay, so what are the benefits of digital diplomacy? So, of course, these things are probably stuff that we all know, right? Reduce costs, right? So it does actually make it much cheaper to do diplomacy, right? Especially for the smaller states that have limited resources. They can't really participate. No, they can't travel here, travel there, and participate in diplomatic negotiations face to face without having to invest in expensive travel. So digital diplomacy is one way that they try to get connected with the rest of the world. Yeah. It also enables direct interaction and engagement with the foreign publics in real time. So that's part of the reason why you see China, right, um, doing its bit on the social media space, right? They want to and of course it helps to bypass the usual state and media filters. It is direct, right, to your audience, to your followers. It's a key channel for reaching out to youth populations, which is basically the population that you want to reach out to and to influence, because they are the tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's adult population. Yeah, so that's why you see, the John Kaysen, right, in Egypt, right, doing that, trying to basically build rapport with the younger population on Twitter. Then you have of course, the emerging revolution in diplomacy, because a lot more diplomats are getting onto the social media space, onto the digital communication tools, and that has changed the traditional sort of government to government, government to people diplomatic engagement, which we know of as public diplomacy, right? It's more of top-down, government to government-driven public diplomacy, to a people to government, people to people diplomacy. So this is basically also democratizing information, leveling the playing field by making information accessible to anyone, anywhere. So you find that foreign ministries are also starting to have to be more nimble, right, with actually addressing things that come out from, on the social media space. Um, having to, because they have to respond if, let's say, there's anything negative on the social media space, have to do that quite immediately to correct the impressions, right, the negative perceptions. They have also used social media to crowdsource public opinion, right, and to get new ideas. So in Germany, for example, they actually used this during Angela Merkel's time in 2014 in their foreign policy review. Um, but again, like we said just now, digital diplomacy will not replace classical diplomacy. It complements it, it strengthens the work of the state in a faster and more cost-effective way. Okay, so let's take a look at this video on real-time diplomacy.
I ask myself, how can a foreign policy that is both substantive and nimble be designed and implemented when Twitter is faster than the CIA and sometimes more accurate? Also, how can communication-based public diplomacy be conducted when there is so much pressure to respond at high speed and make yourself heard amongst a cacophony of voices? Is it the business of a nation's embassy to be effective on social media or to be effective on official diplomacy? The answer is more complicated than it may seem, because diplomacy and media, no strangers to each other, are becoming entwined in new ways. Publics expect to be spoken to, and they expect to be heard. This makes listening one of the most underrated of diplomatic skills, exceptionally important. If diplomats fail to listen, they will miss important voices, many of them belonging to non-state actors. In Egypt in 2011, the Facebook page of We Are All Khalid Said provided real-time insights into the movement that was reshaping Egypt. Intelligence services have come to recognize the value of monitoring online products of Al-Qaeda and its siblings. On a more benign level, listening to global publics can provide invaluable insights about social and political attitudes, which can allow diplomats to more precisely evaluate the environments in which they work. The content on Sina Weibo provides useful information about trends in China, and similar examples abound. Now, pulling together all these many factors, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the future of diplomacy? The great equalizer effect of new communication technologies can bring unprecedented closeness to the individual citizen's relationship to her or his state, and therefore enhances the work of diplomats who champion democracy, human rights, and related ideals. As for speed, a key element of real-time diplomacy, there is no going back to the day when a president could go sailing and feel confident that with the wind behind him, he could outpace the news cycle. Instead, we must recognize that a tweet from an embassy can precipitate a political crisis, and a YouTube video can ignite violent mobs. Real-time diplomacy must be developed with full recognition of such new realities. I remain optimistic about this new diplomatic environment because I have faith in the positive effects of broader dissemination of information to broader publics. Diplomats will gradually adjust to the newest media forms, just as they did to the advent of television. Well, I think NGOs have already proved that they are using social media and other internet-based media greatly to their advantage. One organization that comes to mind is Doctors Without Borders, who are able to provide content using their website, provide video and statistics and that sort of thing, that news organizations and individuals may take. And in other words, no longer does Doctors Without Borders have to rely on the BBC covering a particular case. They can get that information out on their own, perhaps not to as large an audience, but if they make enough noise, presumably the BBC and others will pick it up. So I think getting back to that whole issue of empowerment, this is a tool for NGOs and others to use that is really unprecedented and letting you reach out directly to the public. And people who are interested in what you're doing now know to look for you online, to look for your product. So you don't have to sit around any longer saying, if only we could get the news media to cover this. You can generate on your own, and that's really important. Facebook, for example, trains governments and individual political leaders on how to use it within the. I don't know what the FCO does exactly, but I know at the U.S. State Department, one of Hillary Clinton's senior aides was a gentleman named Alec Ross, who had worked on social media in the Obama 2008 campaign, came over to work for her, and really, with her firmly behind it, got into this idea of 21st century statecraft, which includes the use of social media. And there is training for State Department employees, and they also provide what was being done under Ross's leadership, were tech workshops around the world as part of U.S. public diplomacy. So not only were U.S. diplomats being trained, but also people elsewhere in the world knowing that even if they don't have pervasive technology, newest technology at the moment, they will be getting there soon. So it has been during the past 4 years, I think, pretty fully integrated within the U.S. Foreign Service operation.
Do you think it will, to some extent, take over from traditional diplomacy?
No, not anytime soon. Anyway, it's still kind of anarchic, and that's which I guess regular diplomacy is too sometimes. But it's But I think that there's still a sense of people wanting to retain a fair amount of control, of the actual policymakers wanting to retain control, and they'll say, okay, we'll listen, we'll communicate, but when it gets right down to it, our policy toward Russia or toward Egypt or toward South Africa or whatever is going to be determined not by some sort of democratic social media confluence, but rather by us.
Okay, hope that was enlightening from somebody who's a diplomat himself. Yeah. Okay, so what are the risks of digital diplomacy? Basically, again, the same sorts of risks that you and I face. I mean, normal, usual people face with getting onto the internet and onto the digital space, right? Usual risks of information leakage, hacking, anonymity of internet users. So you'll remember in I think early noughties early noughties WikiLeaks, right, published 250,000 emails, diplomatic cables between the U.S. State Department and U.S. missions around the world. Yeah, they basically, managed to. Basically, it's information leak that was that would have an impact on national security issues. So that's the risk of digital democracy. But there is a consequence that comes with digital democracy, with the move towards the information environment, is that you find that a number of people, right, would suddenly become so woke, right, become aware, opinionated, but without becoming actually well informed. Yeah. Then there's of course, you also find that traditional media also have less incentive to function for the elites. They are less dependent actually as a lapdog. Sorry, not laptop. Lapdog of the elites. They are less dependent on the elites for credible information. They can actually get the information from elsewhere, right? But of course, its role as gatekeeper has collapsed because you find that with digital diplomacy, with rather the digital age, right? People are being able to bypass the traditional media is being bypassed, right? Because foreign actors can directly tweet, right? State actors can directly tweet with their citizens, with the citizens of the opposite state as well, right? Just like Trump. So bypassing the the normal traditional media, right, as a vehicle of disbursement of information. So its role as a gatekeeper has basically collapsed. And of course, you also find that with digital media, there is self-selection. People do self-select certain platforms that they would use, they choose, right? And there are social media algorithms that also would push specific information based on your profile, right? So that has basically eroded the information commons, um, uh, uh, the common platforms that common source of information that people would have, right? Would get the information from, and so as a result, you have informational silos, and that basically has led to and made hyper fragmentation even worse, and that's reinforced cleavages, encourage political polarization. And so these are basically the criticisms, right, of social media, of the algorithms, of what the large tech giants are doing. Yeah. So there's many access points also for alternative information to reach the public. In the end, the public needs to be their own curator, right, of the information. They have to verify all the information to make sure that they are not um, picking up on false information or fake news, right? And because of this spread of fake news as well, traditional media has also lost public trust. Yeah, so that has also decreased the ability of journalists to hold power to account. Yeah, because the traditional media has always been a watchdog of the government, watchdog of the powerful, the voice of people, right? It's supposed to hold the powerful to account, but with the collapse of, traditional media as a gatekeeper, and with the rise of fake news, that has actually eroded trust in the traditional media. And I'm sure quite a number of you don't read the news anymore, right? You don't read, Straits Times, for example, or any of the more traditional news outlets like BBC, New York Times, um, The Economist, Wall Street Journal. Yeah. Okay, so um, you feel that you get less informed reading Straits Times. Okay, so where do you get your news from? New York Times, yeah. Washington Post, Guardian, Economist. Yeah. So you see, that's the thing. Now you are actually forced to go look for information yourself if you want to, if you are even interested in doing it, right? Yeah. But no, there are some of us who can't be bothered to go look for information or to go seek different information sources, and that's where you right back to grounded rationality. Ah, yeah. So that's where you lose out, right? No love for Al Jazeera. Yes, actually, okay. I don't mind Al Jazeera, but sometimes it's very difficult to navigate. The drop down boxes. So that's my beef with Al Jazeera. Reuters, right? Reuters seems to actually not put out more than a few days on its website anymore. It used to, I used to be able to go back at least 1 week, but I can't now. Financial Times is always be hidden behind a paywall, so that's horrible. Um, Other than that, can't remember. I do sometimes look at Nikkei Asia, so sometimes they do have pretty good articles on the region. Um, what else is there? SCMP, although some people will say that SCMP is now towing the Chinese line, right? Okay, SCMP needs only 1 grain of salt. I thought it's maybe a teaspoon of salt. uh, yeah. I mean, Straits Times, I mostly eyeball it for things that are going around the world. I mean, because it's a good sort of like, good to look at it and see, okay, what is in on the Asia page, what's on the world page, you know. But normally, usually, because like sometimes New York Times, right, you can only access, I think, 2 or 3 articles per month, right? But Straits Times does actually reproduce the New York Times. So sometimes you see that actually, copy and paste Straits Times articles, but it's actually not Straits Times. I mean, it's on Straits Times website, but it's actually a New York Times article. Okay, so there are 4 ways of in which polarization actually affects foreign policy, according to Baum and Porter. Yeah. So if you, I mean, again, this is another assigned reading that I've also summarized here. Yeah. So basically, Baum and Porter says that it's very difficult to get bipartisan support for risky takings or ambitious or risky undertakings because of polarization, right? You cannot basically find common ground across, the I mean, they're talking about basically the 2 parties in the US. Yeah, it's also difficult to reach agreement across parties on policy failures. So as a result, you don't really learn and adapt from the past experience. You sort of like just put it down as one of the policy failures, and then you just move on. There's also a risk of dramatic policy swings from one administration to the other, especially if the next administration is from the opposite party, right? And that does complicate long-term commitments, especially to allies and adversaries. Now, of course, there's the heightened vulnerability of the political system to foreign intervention because people are actually so polarized in the system. So the consequences are, of course, the collapse of you know, uh, the information commons, erosion of the media as a neutral arbiter, and greater susceptibility to misinformation. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens when foreign policy meets social media. This particular video, the audio isn't very good, but it's a little bit muffled, but I think you can still make out what it says.
The social media you engage in, the movies you watch, and even the political cartoons you see are seen by many diplomats and extremists as weapons of soft power in the war to win the hearts and minds of people.
The modern world has actually made this question of soft power and culture even more significant because the rise of social media and the changes in the way the world operates from a global standpoint have distributed power around the world in individual groups and even among individuals in a way that we haven't seen for many centuries.
Internet activist Julian Assange was one of those individuals whose recent disclosure of classified documents was seen as a soft power attack on governments, spy agencies, and prying open the back door of diplomacy.
With the WikiLeaks, the Tea Party movement, etc., we're noticing that it makes it more difficult to do, let's say, closed-door diplomacy. It's also more difficult to do propaganda.
Former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff, who co-authored the Patriot Act, pointed to how a soft power cartoon provoked a nearly hard power use of deadly force.
A classic example is those people who view American culture, movies, and literature as imperialistic. And this is a big part of the narrative of the Islamist extremists, that American culture is degrading, it invades the indigenous culture. And the best proof of that is the amount of effort that the terrorists are putting into trying to kill the people who ran the cartoons in Denmark. Now, the cartoons are the softest of soft power, and yet that is viewed as a major gross breach of propriety by the extremists, and so they're willing to kill you for doing that.
Chertoff also said that while trying to win the hearts and minds in Somalia, the U.S.'s failure to pull the trigger and use hard power gave Osama bin Laden the ability to use the soft power of the Internet to say the U.S. was weak.
After the United States left Somalia, in the wake of that Black Hawk Down incident. Bin Laden is supposed to have said to people, you see, this shows the Americans don't have the will to fight. I would argue much of what happened in the years after, and much of the prestige Bin Laden got, was the belief that America was weak and was unwilling to do some very difficult things.
But the soft power sword of social media and the internet also took a swipe at al-Qaeda.
Ayman Zawahiri, who is the number 2 in al-Qaeda, did an internet town hall meeting. And in that meeting, it came right after they had their affiliate in Algeria had exploded a bomb, I think in front of the Algerian Supreme Court, and they killed a number of civilians, including a school bus full of children. And some of the people on the internet chat were very critical about the fact that Muslim school children had been killed, and why had Zawahiri done this.
And when it comes to the war on terrorism in Afghanistan, the former Homeland Security Chief said that President Obama and his predecessor George Bush agree on the use of soft and hard power.
The administration has continued to put troops into Afghanistan, which I think is a good thing. At the same time, the President and Secretary Clinton have spoken about the importance of engaging with Muslim communities around the world, and I think that's a good thing.
Many senior diplomats have told me that in foreign policy, a lack of alternatives clarifies the mind. And when the only choice seems to be hard power, the use of soft power becomes very attractive. Frank Uciardo for CBS News, New York.
Okay, so now one of the things that we also realize is that there are, with social media, right? The relationship that we see, that we are so used to, right, between citizens, leaders, and the media, have actually been disrupted and altered. So you find that the elite's ability to successfully frame any of these events, right, independently, is actually reduced. And of course, it's also in a way has affected the citizens' ability to constrain their leaders as well. So there are basically, if you look at the what we call the disruptive forces, right, in the social media age, there's basically 2 different types of forces at work. One is the centripetal force, which is basically, if you look at how Baum and Porter talks about the elasticity of reality, the centripetal force actually are factors that collapse or narrow the elasticity of reality. So basically what it does is it allows social media citizen journalism actually allows citizens access to information that's independent of their government. So that's why it narrows the elasticity of reality. So it basically restricts, right, the way that the elites can actually influence their citizens. And it also, and then of course the fact that media is also becoming delegitimized, it actually undercuts its role as the intermediary between the citizens and their leaders. Whereas in centrifugal force, right, these are basically what we would see as factors that increase the elasticity of reality. So there are basically 4 factors, right? The same 4 factors, right, would actually contribute to this as well. By basically, you introduce noise, you make it difficult for citizens to figure out what's happening, and then the elites framing of the events is then advantage. So it gives it gives more advantage to the elite in terms of their ability to frame events and to influence the people. So the net effect really of these 2 elasticities of reality is that it's rather ambiguous. On balance, right, it seems that centrifugal forces that expand elasticity and erode democratic constraints seem to be more powerful. Okay, but in terms of the impact of social media on politics is that basically politicians, right, would actually, because they want to retain power, they want to, come back into office, they will usually shift their attention to the median party member rather than the median voter. So they are actually appealing to, their party members rather than to the median voter. So that basically polarizes the political environment. And the public is also less able to function effectively because they are basically um, feeding into the information silos. Yeah, so they are not so well informed. And also it basically causes them to be less able to function as democratic citizens, and it also challenges or dampens their ability and capacity to learn, because they are feeding from the same information silo. Okay, so if you look at it this way, you'll find that polarized political environment makes it harder for citizens to hold their leaders to account. Oops, I'm sorry, I need to take this call. Okay, guys, so sorry about that. Yeah, so okay, we were talking about the polarized political environment that results because of the hyper fragmented, hypermedia kind of environment, right? It basically makes it harder for citizens to hold their leaders to account. Um, and as a result, right, you find that that also undermines their advantage in foreign policy negotiations. Um, and that also makes war more likely because if, let's say, citizens were to hold their leaders to account, they are more likely to resist, possibly, right, going to war, right? Also, elite whistleblowing will only inhibit leaders if there's a credible threat of the public hearing about it. So, which means that leaders will, just continue to do what they want to do, right? They will not be basically held back or restrained. And you find that Democratic leaders, because they are less likely to be held to account, they start to closely resemble their autocratic counterparts. Sounds rather familiar, right? Sounds like the administration that just went by 4 years ago. I mean, the last 4 years. Right? And then you find that the rally around the flag phenomenon is also dampened due to polarized politics because elite now basically the citizens are less likely um, to be convinced by the elites selling of the message. And also, you find that with the changes in the information environment, that leads to greater elasticity of reality. Um, it it heightens the possibility that the leaders in foreign policy will be further out of step, right, with the public. And so basically, democratic constraint, democratic foreign policy is basically out of equilibrium. So this is actually Baum and Porter's review of probably, I mean, if you look at when it was actually published, it was 2019. So you could look at it as a review of what happened during the Trump years. Okay, I have one more video on the future of diplomacy.
We have seen in the last 70 years the enormous influence of the media in its broadest possible panoply. And that has become very, very significant. And so people every day know as much often at 8 o'clock in the morning as the president does about what his foreign policy agenda is going to be for that day and for the next week. And that's very significant because in democracies, knowledge is power. And power from the people plays an enormous role in how decisions are made. But I think it goes without saying that today science and technology does have a significant influence on American diplomacy. We have to have people who can think creatively, not just on the basis of traditional state interests, but how and in what way the dictates of physics, the laws of chemistry play a role in what you can possibly do to deal with those issues. And so some examples are things like climate change and the environment and energy policy. But others fall into a different hopper. For a long time, an issue that I call poverty, growth, and development has been essentially a major preoccupation of American diplomacy. Well, science plays a huge role in making things better in many ways. Science and health can't be divorced. The next 20 or 30 years is obviously going to produce greater challenges. And in my view, that means that even more creative ideas and activities, even more creativity has to be applied to diplomacy. And in many ways, I think one of the most rewarding aspects of diplomacy is to come up with your colleagues often with those creative ideas that can work to solve very difficult problems, often things not thought about when the problem was first analyzed, but nevertheless out there. And so there will be, in that regard, maybe interestingly enough, a place in the scheme of diplomacy for smart machines, for smart thinkers. I would never replace diplomats with robots, but I think that the more that we can handle big data, the more that we can see trends, the more that we have advanced analytical capabilities, the more that we have systems which can detect changes in various areas and in various ways. That too might add in a significant way. If we can do it for war, we ought to be able to do it twice as well for peace.
Okay. Did you find anything interesting in what he said? Did anything there sort of like intrigue you? No? Doing diplomacy using bots, using robots, using AI? Would that be something that might be the direction in the coming years, do you think? I thought that was pretty interesting. I mean, looking at possibilities, right, in the future that we never ever would have thought of might be, come about, but it just might, right? Okay, so let's take a recap of learning outcomes for Block 6. So this was what the Block 6 was all about. We're talking about domestic structure and regimes, how the importance of these in the making of foreign policy, right? You should be able to evaluate the role of the domestic system, economic system in the foreign policy process. You should be able to look at role of interest groups and the media and shaping public opinion on foreign policy. Okay, so these are some exam questions that you probably would, that is probably related to this block. Yeah. So these are basically past year exam questions. Do you think you will be able to answer these? Given that we have actually covered right the content already, more or less. Yeah, you think so? Somewhat manageable. I hope so. I hope that it would be somewhat manageable. Mm, yeah, you probably need to organize your notes a bit. I think the second one you all probably should be able to do, right? Does the media set foreign policy agendas or respond to them, right? Now that's basically talking about the media as an agenda setter versus, a lapdog of the government, just playing a supportive role to the government, right? So you can talk about also, all the three different models that we talked about today, right? Um, public diplomacy, media broker diplomacy, right? So I think the second question should be quite manageable. You should be able to answer the second question quite easily. The first one is related to what we talked about weeks, remember? The authoritarian regimes, the boss, the machine, right? Um, the junta and all that. Yeah. Authoritarian governments more prone to aggressive foreign policies than democracies. So then you may want to think about not just, when we talk about weeks and all that, it's actually more about military, um, armed conflict, right? But you would also want to think in terms of other sorts of policies as well, not just armed conflict, but also economics or whatever. Yeah. Does the media here refer to only traditional media or social media? Okay, you would want to bring in social media as well, given that we cannot ignore social media. Okay, so the media can be traditional media, can be social media. Yeah, but um, if you want to think about, I mean, the traditional media is probably the one that has a lot more written on it, right, compared to the social media, new media, etc. Yeah, but we cannot ignore digital diplomacy. Yeah. So you in your response, you will want to sort of be clear about which type of media you are talking about. Because remember that social media is now used for public diplomacy. Yeah, so you could actually put social media, your discussion of social media, within the model of the public diplomacy. Mm. Okay, so you have is public opinion an enabling source of action or constraint on action for foreign policy decision makers? This one you can even bring in partner. Yeah, because remember that there's the two-level decision policy making, right? and there's the basically a level two. At the level two, you bring it back to the domestic audience, right? The domestic um, political arena, and that's where the domestic constituents will have some say, right? Actually, have you? I forgot to mention this. Did you read about Joe Manchin, that he threw a spanner in the works for Biden's Build Back Better Act? Do you remember that? It's just this week, and now basically a lot of Democrats are actually trying to. Democrats are basically throwing brickbats at him, and then Republicans are now wooing him, right? Because he's the 50th Democrat, right? Because remember that the Senate is evenly split, right? 50-50, right? So Republicans are trying to woo him over to their side now and asking him to join GOP. Because he's been openly clashing with the Democrats and refusing to support some of the spending bills, right? So Build Back Better Act, I'm quite sure you all know what that is, right? That is the one where they are trying to challenge the BRI, the fake Democrat. Yeah, so the Build Back Better World Act, right? The B3W Act, right? It's actually part of that G7 thingy that they actually came out with this infrastructure, competing infrastructure uh, to the BRI, right? Yeah, he's actually talking about going independent, actually. Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think. I think Biden and all that they have not been. They have not been listening. Okay, so this is the one where he talks about how he's rejected the idea of joining the GOP, but has indicated that he's open to being independent. Yeah, so he refused to ratify. I mean, I guess the Build Back Better Act is I think it is the one that is associated with the it's the competing infrastructure that the G7 has proposed, right? To compete against BRI. So he's not wanting to spend that much money, right? He's rejecting the call to spend more money, and he came up with a suggested, or supposedly he came up with a suggested spending bill, which is probably about less. I mean, definitely less than what was proposed by Biden's administration. Wow, you guys don't like him, eh? But they're saying that he is like the John McCain of GOP. When John McCain actually rejected, right, the GOP's trying to can Obamacare, right? So basically, Joe Manchin is like the John McCain of Democrat Party. That's what some people are saying. Yeah, most of the time, except for that Obamacare thingy, I think. But he was also quite he was quite critical of the GOP. I don't know. This is The Hill. I don't know whether y'all read The Hill, but The Hill is also quite. I mean, The Hill is quite a little. I don't know whether it is. I can't remember who is the. Yeah, The Hill is also another one that's good to read if you are interested in looking at what is going on in Congress. Okay, so yeah, so I was thinking. I mean, the B3W is actually a something that needs to be ratified also locally, right, in the US. So his main issue is that they spend too much. That's what he's saying. I don't know. Yeah, that is his that has been his push all along. How are we gonna be paying for all these things? And so he has been not very keen on uh, all the spending. Mm. But they're saying that if he doesn't agree to it, that would actually also tank the economy because there's nothing to drive the economy the next year. I think what he's also worried about is that you have all these projects that's given a short 1 year period of funding. Then what happens after that, right? The next year definitely you will still have to continue funding, right? So where's the money going to come from? The Feds have a radical $1 trillion coin idea. Yeah, they just feel that I guess it's Keynesian economics, isn't it? Is it Keynesian where you increase government spending, it's gonna have multiplier effect, blah blah blah. You know? I forget. Economics been a long time. Yeah, because it's supposed to, right? Y equals to C plus I plus G, right? Plus X minus M, right? Do you remember? Or am I saying something that you guys economics? Yes. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Consumption, investment, government, and then net exports. Yeah, one thing about the US is because it's an international currency, right? They can always print. You know. Anyway, okay, I guess that's all I have for you for this year. Yeah, so these, I hope you guys can, I mean, these sorts of questions you all feel comfortable in answering. They can default on their debt without inflation. Seriously. Okay. But they're talking about reining in inflation. What? The Feds, right? Increasing interest rates. You'll probably see a lot more rate hikes next year. Yeah, probably. All right, I guess the rest of the stuff we shall cover next year. Because we are going to be moving on to block 7. I think I'm actually really running behind, but I hope to get 7, 8, 9 done. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Right? We need to get all those done next year. If you can just go through the stuff that was on the next slide. I think the major powers, major powers, middle powers, small powers, and weak states. I think you all should understand or know what it is all about. Yeah. So yeah, maybe you might want to just go through those slides that the rest of the slides to the end, because it's quite self-explanatory, and I have a number of videos there. So I might just skim over those things next year when we come back. Yeah. Anyway, have a good Christmas break. Happy holidays to all of you. Please stay safe, stay home, right? And yeah, I'll see you guys next year. All right. Thank you all for coming. Please, please, please don't forget to attempt the activities, right, in Edmodo, and I'll try to get your stuff marked. I'm so sorry. I'm really, really running behind this time. Yeah. Okay. Jin Yao, you're into public holidays, the festivities, yeah? Yeah, next year CNY is early, February. Alrighty, thank you all for coming. Enjoy yourselves. Take care. Have a good break. Come back refreshed, I hope. I don't know whether I will be. I'll try. Alrighty, you guys. Stay safe, yeah? Yes. I will try to. You guys rest well as well, yeah? Oh, thanks, Gerald. Yeah. Hope so too, but I don't think he's gonna be coming back till next year.